Good day, this is Jove Aguas, and welcome to my lectures in the Philosophy of Karol Wojtyla, or Saint John Paul II. In the second part of the lecture, I will be focusing on the philosophical influences of Karol Wojtyla. There are three important philosophical influences in Karol Wojtyla. First, Saint John of the Cross. Second is Saint Thomas Aquinas. And the third is the philosopher Max Scheler. Now let's focus on phenomenology. His engagement with phenomenology. If you recall in our discussion on the life of Karol Wojtyla, it was Cardinal Sapieha who suggested to Karol Wojtyla that he study and work for his second doctorate in preparation for university-level teaching, despite, of course, his preference for pastoral work. Remember that Wojtyla already acquired or obtained his doctoral in theology. First, studied in Rome at the Angelicum to take his doctoral in theology, but of course he was never granted the degree there because he was not able to publish his manuscript. He was conferred the degree of doctorate in theology by the Jagiellonian University when he submitted an extended version of that dissertation. So it was the Jagiellonian University who conferred his degree in theology. But that degree will not allow him to teach in in the state university, okay? Because his degree in theology is for theology. It is an ecclesiastical degree. He needs a civil degree in order for him to teach in a state university. Therefore, he was it was suggested by Cardinal Sophia that he takes a second doctorate in philosophy this time. So Wojtyla, upon the suggestion of Father Ignacy Ruszczyk, a theological faculty at the University of Krakow, suggested that he writes on a topic about the compatibility of the ethical system of the German phenomenologist Max Scheler and the received Catholic ethics. Remember that when he was influenced by Roman Ingarden and by the other phenomenologists at the University of Krakow. So these are the same faculty members who encouraged Wojtyla to write on the phenomenologist Max Scheler and apply that to Catholic ethics. So Roman Ingarden, one of the respected faculty members of a professor in Poland, introduced him to Max Scheler. So Wojtyla's interest on Saint John of the Cross and on the Carmelite spirituality led him to discover the philosophical work of Edith Stein. Of course, she would later become Saint Benedicta of the Cross, and it was actually John Paul II who canonized Saint Benedicta of the Cross. So this connection must have led him to phenomenology. Okay? So Saint John of the Cross, and then Carmelite spirituality, then Edith Stein, and then Ingarden, and then phenomenology. You can just connect the dots. So, but whatever aroused the interest of Wojtyla in phenomenology, the decisive factor that consolidated it really was his encounter with Roman Ingarden, one of the greatest and original students of Husserl, and a dominant figure in the cultural milieu of Krakow. So, the connection between Wojtyla and Scheler is Roman Ingarden, and the connection between Wojtyla and Saint Thomas Aquinas is Garrigou Lagrange. Okay, of course, add to the mix Garrigou Lagrange and Tyranovsky with his connection to Saint John of the Cross. So although Stein and Garden were not followers of Scheler, both had a marked interest in anthropology and ethics, and they employed phenomenology and ethics rather than in cognition. So they were not, in the sense, they were not following the project of Husserl, because Husserl applied phenomenology to epistemology or to cognition. So similar to Heidegger, Heidegger did not apply phenomenology to epistemology, very much unlike his teacher Husserl. He applied it to ontology, okay, or to existence, if you want. So for Ingarden, phenomenology is not a philosophical system, but a method of philosophical inquiry, which can be applied in diverse ways and can work together with the most diverse philosophies. So it's a method of inquiry, and it can be applied to any topics, to any subject matter in philosophy. So he recommended that to Karol Wojtyla. So now his encounter with Max Scheler. Wojtyla took a copy of the basic work of Max Scheler on ethics, the Der Formalismus, or Formalism and the Ethics of Substantive Values. And to facilitate his grasp of the book, he actually translated this book from German to Polish. So subsequently, Wojtyla wrote a dissertation on Max Scheler entitled An Evaluation of the Possibilities of Building a Christian Ethics on the Principles of Max Scheler's System. So it's an application of Max Scheler's phenomenology to Christian ethics. Whether we can build a Christian ethics based on Max Scheler's phenomenology. So it's a combination of phenomenology and Christian ethics. Wojtyla had to translate a lot of Scheler's work so that he could work on him and do a philosophical and theological analysis of Scheler's mind. Scheler's effort was an indicator of his philosophical development, especially at this point of his career. It implied that he looked at Scheler as a possible guide in searching for answers about ethics and values, that the answers to the question like what is good or why be good, which cannot be found in the neo-scholasticism of Garrigou-Lagrange. Why be good? Of course, there may be answer in Thomism of why be good, but he's looking for a more personal answer to that question. Later, Wojtyla would remark that the work of Scheler opened up a new world, a world of values, fresh view of mankind. So it's like opening new doors for Wojtyla. Of course, Wojtyla did not lock himself into intellectual combat with the philosophical method that had been taught, as certain forms of neo-Thomism might have been an obstacle to a genuine Catholic encounter with modern philosophy. So he has to be open, he has to open his mind to these new ideas. With a solid ground on Thomism, Wojtyla was open to engage modern philosophy on its own terms. So it's a solid foundation on Thomism, and he's confident that he can engage modern philosophy in its own terms. And years later, he would recall that wrestling with Kant's second categorical imperative, that is about the human person, the dignity of the human person, was particularly important for his later thinking. The outcome would be that Wojtyla would regard years later as a way of doing philosophy that synthesized both approaches, meaning the metaphysical realism, the objectivity of Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas, and the sensitivity to human experience, the subjective side of Max Scheler's phenomenology. So it was Max Scheler's phenomenology, it was his personalism which rescued moral philosophy from the dry abstractions of Kantian ethics and restored the pathos, the ecstasy, the ethos to human life that Wojtyla found most attractive. So he was attracted to the personalism of Max Scheler. Okay? But that's just one side or one part of the story. The method of phenomenology. Phenomenology, or the phenomenology of Husserl, developed a system of disencumbering the mind of all philosophical and other presuppositions in the underlying confidence that by the process of intellection or by the process of bracketing or reduction, we will arrive at the thing in itself. So for Husserl, we have to go back to the things in themselves. And in order to go back to the things in themselves, we have to bracket our own biases and presuppositions. The mind, whether the intellect or the will or feeling, as in the case of Scheler, because Scheler recognizes the will or the feeling, the emotions, could at least sufficiently comprehend the most important aspect of reality, meaning the eidos, or the essence of things. And it further sought to develop a method, a methodology, an approach for mirroring a given reality in its essence and making it possible to presume its existence. So through the phenomenological method, the method of bracketing or and reduction, we can arrive at the essence, at the eidos of things, at the things in themselves. So, Scheler applies phenomenology to ethics, and he recognized that, as against Kant, that aside from the sensible and the formal, meaning the intellectual, there's a third, there's a third option, and that is our emotions or feelings. And our emotion or feelings, the emotive aspect of our mind, recognizes the value of things. So, Scheler applies phenomenology to ethics. And against Kant, he would argue that aside from the material, meaning the sensible, and the formal or the rational, there's a third aspect of our mind, and that is our emotions, the emotive aspect of our mind, which recognizes the values and things. So there is an a priori set of values which the mind recognizes because of our emotions or feelings. And based on this, Scheler set up a system of 5 kinds of objective values. And he also sketched 5 corresponding ideals or exemplary persons that embody these values in different societies. So, Wojtyla, for his part, he set himself to the task of ascertaining whether the Christian values of ethics could be situated into this Schelerian context, into the Schelerian notion of values. So, he worked on whether he could legitimate or legitimize in a fresh way the imitation of these ideal types, like the saint in the hero, that Scheler had only drafted in anticipating his own further work. So, can we apply these ideal types, like the saints in the hero of Max Scheler, to the ideal persons in Christian ethics, based, of course, on the model of Christ? Tiwa would go against Scheler in this respect. He would argue a number of points in order to uphold traditional Catholic ethics against a new kind of allegedly objective experiential subjectivism. So the main point of Wojtyla here is that we cannot apply or we cannot base ethics or Christian ethics on subjectivism because he regarded the emotivism of Max Scheler as rather subjective. So we do observe that in Christian ethics, there are the ideal of moral perfection, the truly perfect person, Jesus Christ and the evangelical saints, and the saints of the tradition. In this, the ideal is embodied and the values are practiced. The ideal is presented as an obligation in commandments and counsels. The saintly person becomes a model for imitation. Now, the importance of Scheller's phenomenology to Wojtyła's philosophy. Scheller's brand of phenomenology was so important in the development of the thought of Karol Wojtyła, especially because Wojtyła would insist on making revealed ethics constitutive of perennial ethics. So, perennial ethics would be traditional ethics, the Thomistic ethics, but it must be integrated with a kind of personal ethics. So, although eventually in the end, Wojtyła would reject Scheller's system of ethics. Scheler introduced Wojtyła into the phenomenological method of grasping the circumstances of the ethically positive or negative as they are lived through in experience. His anti-Schelerian dissertation is important for the intellectual development of Karol Wojtyła, in having opened the way to further use of the phenomenological method on his own with measured confidence in his subsequent lectures and to some extent in his major works, Love and Responsibility and The Acting Person. So it will be actually be a toss between Thomism and phenomenology as to which one is the main influence of Karol Wojtyła. So the question here is Wojtyła a Thomist or a phenomenologist? That's one question that every other scholar of Wojtyła would like to answer. So many readers of Wojtyła's works have the common opinion that he is both a Thomist and a phenomenologist. His training in both schools of thought is manifested in his works, especially the major one, The Acting Person. And one cannot claim that he is only a phenomenologist or only a Thomist. Because in writing The Acting Person, the substance of that book is basically found in Thomism, established on Thomism, with the approach in discussing these concepts are clearly phenomenological. But the question is he more of a Thomist or a phenomenologist? There are many different opinions as in this subject. Ana Teresa Tamniñeca, the editor of the book Acting Person, insists that he is to be recognized as essentially a phenomenologist. Andrew Wusnicki, a former student and associate in author of Karol Wojtyła's existentialism or existential personalism, insists that he is a Thomist. Jerzy Kalskowski points out that the philosophical thought of Wojtyła can be designated as belonging to Thomism and phenomenology, and a synthesis of both, which I would agree. It's a synthesis of both. Further, he says that not taking into consideration subsequent modification of Wojtyła's philosophy, he was no doubt that St. Thomas' thought lays at the basis of Wojtyła's philosophy. Personally, I agree to this position of Galkowski. Alfred Wilder rather, shares the same opinion. He writes that methodology speaking, Wojtyla is a realist phenomenologist, but the substance of his philosophy is themistic. Okay, so there you go. Now, for Wojtyla, themism is not enough. It should be completed by a subjective analysis which he learned from his study of phenomenology. This somehow shows the attempt of Wojtyla to synthesize themism and phenomenology. He is a phenomenologist in the sense that he finds real worth and values in the phenomenological method and ways of thinking. And I think he manifested that in his writings and even in his pronouncement and even in his papal writings. And only does he show skill in using phenomenological description, he believes that phenomenology is a valid method of philosophizing. When doing philosophy, one has to maintain neutrality, and one must free himself from any bias. Thus, when Wojtyla wishes to describe what is characteristic of human action, he does not want to impose any metaphysical thought pattern upon his description. Instead, he wants human action to appear as it really is in itself. Wojtyla knows the power and attractiveness of this philosophy and its method. Wojtyla's brand of phenomenology is not like that of other phenomenologists. He explicitly rejects the idealistic tendencies of Husserl and the subjectivism or emotivism associated with Max Scheler. He believes that philosophy does not end where other phenomenologists wanted it to end, simply on the subjective description of human experience. For Wojtyla, philosophy must not end with what is simply experienceable. It must go beyond what shows itself in experience and try to explore the causal analysis by causal analysis and come to discover the unexperienceable but novel aspects of reality. We must not only grasp the self-possession and freedom of man in the way they show themselves in experience, we must also endeavor a philosophical analysis that will show what man really is because of what is revealed in his action. And what man really is will ultimately explain that which shows itself. So for these reasons, we can say that he's a real Thomist. His vision of man is substantially in accord with that of St. Thomas Aquinas. But in order to show such essence of man, of the human person, he relies on phenomenology. So the substance is St. Thomas, the method is phenomenology. Hence, his Thomism is certainly enriched by phenomenology. He's a Thomist through and through, but he shows his openness and genius by integrating phenomenology in his philosophy. He uses phenomenology as a method in order to ground his anthropology to experience, specifically to the first person experience, which is the subjective personal experiences of the human person. Later, as John Paul II, he said, and I will end my discussion with this quotation. My previous Aristotelian Thomistic formation was enriched by the phenomenological method, and this made it possible for me to undertake a number of creative studies. I am thinking above all of my book, The Acting Person, or Person and Act. In this way, I took part in the contemporary movement of philosophical personalism, and my studies were able to bear fruit in my pastoral work. My formation within the cultural horizon of personalism also gave me a deeper awareness of how each individual is a unique person. And through the integration or the synthesis of the Thomistic notion of the person, the objective side of the person, and the experiential personal side of the person, Wojtyla was able to come up with his own brand of personalism. But that interest in the human person is not brought about only by his philosophical interest, but more especially by his personal interest, by his personal encounter with the human person in their own concrete, unique, personal experiences, especially when he was growing up in Poland. So thank you very much for listening.